You may be seated. My friend Darrell was damaged, but some days the damage was more evident than others. Darrell's overseer was a large-hearted Catholic man named Dave who wore a broad smile that made him squint and a helmet of hair worthy of a television evangelist. Dave would come to the noonday Eucharist at Christ Church in Little Rock every Wednesday and give Darrell his weekly allowance of $20 afterward. That's what was left after the $753 he got from the government each month, paid for a tiny roach-infested house in North Little Rock, plus a stray court fine or two, and his utilities. Utilities that could get astronomically high in the wintertime, as Darrell had a bad habit of walking out of his house for the day and forgetting to close the front door. It's expensive to heat a city block in January with a stove that looks and functions like something from 1950s Soviet Russia. But as soon as he received his weekly windfall, Darrell would walk down to the church office and say, Secretary is what he called Carol Lou, the parish administrator. He'd say, Secretary, I want to give 5 to God. And each week we'd try to talk Darrell out of giving a quarter of what he had to live on to the church, occasionally even pointing out that technically the church and God were not synonymous. Each week he'd refuse. I want to give 5 to God, he'd say. 5 to God. So Carol Lou would take an offering envelope, count and seal Darrell's 5 $1 bills inside, and give it back to him so he could write his name in large looping cursive on the back. Now, I know some of you are surprised that I would actually begin a sermon with a story like this one. Not just because it makes such a compelling case for the 25% tithe, which I do hope you've noted, but because when people happen to compliment a sermon of mine, they often begin with something like, you know, I had no idea where you were going at the beginning, but it did get a little better. So maybe you're surprised that this preacher has finally led with an illustration that makes plain sense. Darrell and his $5 gift is a plausible modern version of the widow who put 2 copper coins into the treasury and became the Christian definition of giving it your all for the next 2,000 years, right? The sermon should pretty much write itself from here. And how convenient that it happens to be stewardship season when the lectionary serves us up this tidy little morality play about giving generously. But there's a problem. You knew there would be a problem. The problem is, I don't think Darrell really cared about the persistence of an old Episcopal downtown church. I know he didn't give it $5 each week for the material support of its mission. He gave $5 because he thought God might be pleased instead of angry with him and make Darrell's life a little bit better in return. There's a problem with the Bible story too, I think. Because I don't know about the widow, but I'm not sure Jesus cared much more about the temple than Darrell does about the church. Maybe you noticed that just before he commended the woman for putting 2 copper coins, all she had to live on, into the temple treasury, Jesus told people to beware of the scribes who ran that very temple. He said they like to walk around in long robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to have the best seats in the synagogue and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, he said, and for the sake of appearance, say long prayers. Thank goodness we modern clergy bear no resemblance whatsoever to these scribes. Or maybe except for the long robes. All right, occasionally the long self-serving public prayer. Actually, and I have gotten a really good seat at some very nice banquets recently. But I have never eaten a poor widow's house, not in one sitting at least. Anyway, Jesus is not terribly high on the people who run the temple that this woman's coins were going to support, was he? And then, immediately following today's reading, Jesus comes out of the temple, and his disciples say this. They say, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." To which he replies, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. all will be thrown down. Impressive stone temples and handsome old brick churches are not what's forever, you know. So let's see. Where was I? Oh, right. I was in the middle of a great big swing and a miss of a stewardship sermon. After having that softball of a gospel lofted right up here into the pulpit, apparently the selfless gift Jesus commended to us all was to support vain, unscrupulous clergy and a beautiful building that would be a pile of rubble one day. Suddenly, the stewardship sermon seems to be unwriting itself. At least it is if the widow's coins were supposed to be seen as some kind of wise or responsible investment in a religious institution. But let's stay with the story a little bit longer and see if there's any good news that hasn't leaked completely out of it yet. A theologian named James Allison says that Judaism and Christianity are religions of the collapsing temple. The destruction of Solomon's temple nearly 600 years before Jesus' birth and the collapse of its replacement in 70 A.D. were defining events in the history of these sister religions. But even knowing that it had happened before, the temple's destruction must have been unimaginable in Jesus' day, because the temple dominated everything in Jerusalem. Not just because of its size, not just because of the bustling, vibrant market for sacrificial beasts or even the sounds and smell of all that animal carnage. The temple dominated everything because it was, in Allison's words, the center of a pattern of desire, which drew people in and gave them a sense of belonging, which fused together learning, divinity, national identity, career, money, reputation, and so on. The temple was everything. It made sense that Jesus' disciples would have been impressed and even comforted by its large stones and the permanence they suggested. In times of uncertainty, surely at least this will stay put, even if some of the clergy within it are a little vain and shady. This would have been as true for them as it was for the poor woman who gave it everything she had. Only Jesus remained strangely indifferent to the center of everyone else's world. What fascinated Jesus was people. He said the sacred is not to be found in fancy religious leaders or in the impressive buildings they sashay around in. In Jesus, a version of the old ways of Exodus and Leviticus is beginning to be remembered when God said, "I will walk among you and will be your God, and you will be my people." No temple necessary. People are enough. Ordinary people, marginal people even, migrants in the wilderness of Palestine, or maybe even just one generous widow giving her last 2 coins to the temple she couldn't imagine her life without. Simple, honest acts of faith and generosity. These are what captivated Jesus, even in support of a fallen institution. Simple, honest acts of faith and generosity struck Jesus as more real, more enduring, more worthy of his attention and his affection than all those big temple stones. And it's not ridiculous. People stacked those stones up in the first place, didn't they? People also tore them down. But something more enduring than the buildings survived. In the rubble of Solomon's temple's collapse, Judaism became a text-based religion as the words of the prophets and the histories of Israel's life with God were written down. People did that with God's help. And when that second temple would come down, a few decades after Jesus lived, the sacrificial system effectively ceased to be. But Judaism did not. It continued in a new rabbinic form, and a grafted-on branch called Christianity also began to grow and flourish. Because the genius of the temple was not in its stones. It was in the people who stacked them up time and again and moved around within. It was in anybody who offered what little she had to this great effort. Which is surely why among everything that was so wrong about the temple he'd come to teach in that day, one woman caught Jesus' attention. One woman without status or wealth or power or influence. One woman with just the faith and generosity to give the last 2 coins she had for something greater than herself. That's what fascinated Jesus one afternoon in Jerusalem. Fascinated him more than the scribes and the robes and the great big stacked up stones. What fascinated Jesus was a pure, undiluted image of the faith to give one's life away. Temples come and go, but faith, hope, and love, as one of Jesus' followers would tell us, these are the things that remain. So I learned a lot from my strange friend Daryl. He was, as I said, a damaged soul. Severe schizophrenia and too many drugs combined to make for some very dark seasons in his life during the 12 years I knew him. But the starkest lesson I learned was that his ridiculous and maybe superstitious generosity is what emerged from Daryl when he was at his best. It wasn't a matter of what he had, which was always next to nothing. It was a matter of when he had the faith to let it go that became the surest measure of his wellness I could see. When Daryl was most well, he gave things away. And so it is with you and with me, isn't it? When our souls are most well, we don't cover ourselves up from the world in long robes of what passes for honor and respect and holiness, while we take what we want from whomever we can get it from. No, when our souls are most well, we have the faith to let what we live on go. Which must be why, one day in the temple, this Jesus found himself indifferent to the impressive and the glorious, but fascinated by one poor widow and her 2 copper coins. Fascinated actually by the faith that still burned enough in her to give what she lived on away. The faith that I suppose in some essential way made her well.